Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Julia Bryan, and I'm the Global Chair of Democrats Abroad. I'm joined by Inga Kjamtrup, who's DA UK's chair, Emily Lyons, who's in DA Germany and is the event manager there, and Erin Fishbone from our comms team, as well as our very special guest, David Shor. We really appreciate your support today, and I just want to thank everyone before we get started for all your donations to this event. Thanks to you, we've raised enough money to support calls to almost 10,000 people abroad, potential voters who we are really working hard to help them make sure they know that they can vote and how to vote. Getting in touch with these voters is just really important part of what we do as an organization, and thank you so much for making it affordable for us. Before we get started, I just want to note that we've gathered some questions from our members today, but I also really want to encourage you to use the Q&A box that you'll find at the bottom of your screen to send in your questions for David throughout the call. With that, I'd like to introduce David. David Shor oversees the R&D for Civis's political consulting practice, with a particular focus on election forecasting, causal inference, and resource allocation. If you already know what that means, super, but he is going to tell us for everyone else who doesn't. That's what one of the things he'll be talking about today. Civis's political practice works with political clients that range from large-scale political committees and super PACs to advocacy groups, to nearly every major Democratic 2020 presidential campaign, helping decision makers answer strategic questions around messaging and resource allocation. Prior to being part of the founding team at Civis, David worked at the Obama 2012 campaign, where he specialized in survey methodology and time series modeling. He has his own experience with living and studying abroad, so he's also a DA alumni, and we're really happy that he comes and visits us a lot. He studied math at St. Petersburg, and he's visited us in several places around Europe, and we hope he'll continue his trips in the near future. We're delighted to have him back in the run-up to this election, and I just want everyone to join us in welcoming David to the call. Welcome, David, and take it away.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. It's a real honor. Let me just very quickly present everything. And all right, can everyone see? Great. All right, so today we're going to talk about data and the 2012 election, just broadly speaking, explaining some of the trends to make sense of what's happened in the last 4 to 5 years, and then a little bit about what to expect in 2020. So first, just who am I? I was already introduced so well, by Julia, but just to rehash again, I run an R&D team that focuses on politics. We worked with every 2020 presidential campaign, and we spend in general a lot of time trying to do election forecasting, trying to figure out what races are close, trying to figure out what messages are most effective and what are the best ways to reach voters. And then our team, we have a bunch of data scientists and math nerds, and it's very fun. So I want to start by going back to a happy place, I guess 2016. And so, basically the way to start the story of understanding 2016 and Donald Trump and everything that happened is this one graph. Basically what this graph is showing is the x-axis is the percentage of people in a county. Every single dot here is a county, and the x-axis is the educated percent, the percentage of people with a college degree, and the y-axis is the change in support from 2012 to 2016. And so what we're seeing here is that there were a lot of counties with very low levels of education that, swung 10, 20, or even, 25 points against us, while at the same time, these counties on the other end with very high education levels moved toward us. So, what that means is that in low education counties, there were tons of people who voted for Obama and then for Trump. And in high education, generally urban areas, there were people who did the reverse. And what you can see from the colors is that these low education counties were primarily concentrated in the Midwest. So just to show this graph a different way, we can see that this is showing one graph for presidential and one graph for Senate. And so this education trend was there for the presidential race, but wasn't there for the Senate race. And this allows us to say, this really tells us that this trend that happened, this big realignment on education, was a Trump-specific phenomena, and not, something that was part of a, broader partisan phenomena. So just to put a face on, what these counties that swung against us were, I wanted to just highlight this one town, Hayside. It's right on the Kentucky, West Virginia, Tri-Point border. And it was a place that voted for Democrats pretty consistently for the last 80 years. McGovern won this county, this city, Mondale won this city, and Obama got 80% of the vote in the city. It's a coal town, and it's primarily centered around coal mining. And one of the crazy things about it was just that suddenly it switched from 80% Obama to 80% Trump. So the other thing I'd say about this whole, election is that nobody saw it coming. This was all a surprise. And, what you could see is it's not just that people didn't see that Trump, that Trump was going to win. It's that in particular, Trump overperformed in these kind of low education Midwestern states. And that's where he not just, overperformed 2012, but also overperformed the polls. So the question is, why did this happen? Why didn't anybody see Trump coming? And the first theory that people have is this idea that Trump just inspired all of these people who had been tuned out of politics, all of these non-college educated white voters, to go out and turn out to vote for the first time. And, it just turns out that empirically that isn't true. So, something that's a big part of the work that we do is that whether or not you vote is actually a matter of public record. And so this means that we can go back and look at voter files and look at the characteristics of people who voted in 2012 and the characteristics of people who voted in 2016. And from what we can tell, we can actually see that almost all of the change, I think something like 90% of the change from 2012 to 2016 was changes in people changing their mind and not people voting. And so the key point here is it's not that people came out to vote for Trump for the first time. It's that people who had been Democrats their entire lives decided to, who voted for Obama twice, switched over and decided to vote for Trump. So the question then is, why didn't we see this coming? Why didn't we see all of these Obama-Trump voters coming? And, in order to know that, we kind of have to go back to how surveys work. Broadly speaking, survey response rates have been going down for about 80 years or so. Like when I started in this industry in 2012, roughly 12% of people picked up the phone when you would call them. In 2016, less than 1% of people who we called ended up picking up the phones. And the people who picked up the phones were more educated, they were, and more trusting than people who didn't. And so just to talk a little bit more about trust, social scientists have this concept of social trust. What they, basically the way they ask it is they say, do you think that people can generally be trusted, or do you think that people should keep to themselves? And it turns out, kind of unsurprisingly, that now that response rates are so low, answering a survey itself is kind of a political act. And it turns out that people who trust their neighbors are much more likely to answer the phone than people who don't. And the problem with that, like what this graph over here is showing, is that if you only talk to the people who think that people can be trusted, those people swung incredibly from Obama to Clinton. That group of people became more democratic. These are the people who were living in cities. These are the people who with higher educations. And the people who didn't trust their neighbors and who weren't answering their phones, swung against us. And so, basically there was this silent majority of people who were fed up with institutions, who didn't trust the people around them and didn't answer our phone surveys. And, we, because we didn't talk to them, we didn't know that they were going to vote for Trump. So just to look at who these voters were in a different way, here, we're cross-tabbing polling support by issues. And so the idea is that, on one hand, we have supporting universal healthcare or opposing universal healthcare, and on the other hand, we have amnesty supporting it or opposing it. And what we can see is this group of people who supported universal healthcare and opposed giving a path to citizenship to undocumented immigrants. And what we see is that Obama won these voters, these like pro healthcare, anti-immigrant voters, and Clinton got about 60%, while Clinton lost 20% among these groups. And so this is another way to cast, like, who are these low social trust voters? Who are these low education voters who trended against us? Largely speaking, they're people who agreed with us on healthcare and disagreed with us on immigration. And then, another way I think to look at this election is just to look at the content of the ads. Why is it that this happened? Why is it that all of these voters switched in ways that were correlated with issues? And I think the answer, part of the answer, comes from looking at ads. Historically, the Democratic strategy was that we would run tons of ads talking about democratic issues on taxes, on healthcare, on jobs, on education. And 2016 was different than that. 2016 was the first, going back decades, it was the first election where the vast majority of our ads were personal attacks on our opponent. And we thought that was a good idea. Trump was obviously, one of the most unpopular person to ever run for office. He obviously had a lot of personal flaws, but by not tying Democrats to popular stances on economic issues, that decreased the correlation between how people felt on those issues and how they voted. And that had probably some negative effects. So just to step back from 2016 and look at what's happening everywhere in the world, I think the most important trend probably of the last 60 years to understand why is Trump happening is just this graph of educational attainment over time. When in the post-war era, roughly 5% of the electorate had a college degree, and 75% of the electorate hadn't graduated from high school. At this point, people who haven't graduated from high school are less than 10% of the electorate, and roughly 40% of the electorate has a college degree. This is a massive change, and is really important because it turns out that education is highly correlated with views on authoritarianism, on rule of law, and on immigration, on racial issues, and a bunch of other things. And so as education levels have gone up, unsurprisingly, the relationship between education and how people have voted has changed. So what this graph is showing, it's a little ugly, but it's from Piketty's new book, is basically the gap between college-educated voters and non-college educated voters in the US, France, and Britain over time. And what we can see is that in the post-war era, educated voters who were richer, who are richer than uneducated voters generally voted for conservatives. But over the past 70 years, they've gradually trended more and more Democratic. And at this point, they're now a considerably more left-wing group than non-college educated voters. And structurally, the reason this has been happening is that when college-educated voters were 4% of the electorate, it didn't make any sense electorally to campaign on the values that college-educated voters, care about. Cosmopolitan-loaded values like openness to immigration, racial solidarity, and a bunch of other things. But as the college-educated share of the electorate has increased, it's made sense for center-left parties to chase their votes. And this has opened up space for center-right parties to try to appeal to the non-college educated voters that center-left parties have kind of been neglecting. So just to show what this actually means, here, this is basically showing opinion on racially charged events in the past 50 years. And what you can see is that in the 80s and 90s and even the 2000s, racial resentment was basically uncorrelated with partisanship. But fast forward just to the last 10 years, and suddenly these gaps on partisanship have gotten much, much larger. And the reason is that it used to be, another way to think about this is that it used to be that racially conservative voters who agreed with us on economic issues, were identified as Democrats, while racially liberal voters who disagreed with us on economic issues were Republicans, because that wasn't the dividing line in American society. You know, the dividing line was like opinions on taxes, opinions on healthcare, and now the dividing line is much more, what do you think about immigration? What do you think about race? And so, which is potentially not good, but it is descriptively what's happening. So then another way to look at this is just showing attitudes on immigration over time. And something that's been really interesting is that while Republican attitudes on immigration have been pretty steady, over the past 10 years, Democrats have gotten much more liberal on immigration and on cultural issues. There's some writers call this the Great Awokening that's happened among white Democrats, and it's the largest shift in racial attitudes that has happened in the last, since the end of Jim Crow. So the thing to remember is that it's not that cosmopolitan attitudes have gotten less popular. If anything, they've gotten more popular. Now that the population is so educated, issues that previously were politically toxic now have a fighting chance. The idea that immigration should be increased back in the 90s was more unpopular than legalizing heroin. And now, for the first time ever, immigration being increased versus decreased is roughly on par. The problem is that even though these attitudes are getting more popular, they're getting more popular in the wrong places, because America has a electoral system specifically designed to elevate the views of rural voters and not the views of educated people in cities. So that was 2016. In a bit of a brighter note, I'm going to go back to 2018. So the first thing about 2018 is that turnout was ahistorically high. This was a really big surprise to me and everyone else. 2018 was the highest turnout midterm that we've basically ever seen since we started letting young people vote in 1974. But that said, most of the reason why we did so well wasn't turnout. Turnout actually went up roughly equally among Democrats and Republicans. It was mostly that a bunch of people who voted for Trump decided to vote for Democrats in 2018. And here, this is just showing this by state. And you can see in West Virginia, where Clinton got 27% of the vote. Obviously, we can't win, we did narrowly win, and that's because something like half of Trump voters decided to vote for us. So just to walk through what that victory looked like, the basic answer is that something like a third of these Obama-Trump voters decided to come, something like a third of these Obama-Trump voters decided to come back. So we saw these large gains with non-college educated whites. And at the same time, we saw support among non-white voters soften somewhat. That said, even people didn't notice it as much because Democrats won, but the polling errors state by state that existed in 2016 still were there in 2018. These social trust problems haven't gone away, and that you should remember that, in general, when looking at public polling. So just to talk a little bit about 2020, the first thing is a lot of people came out of 2018 with an enormous amount of optimism because we did so well and had such a big wave. But history should tell us that there's basically no relationship between how well midterms go and how the general election goes the next year. Just to give some examples, 1994 and 2010 were horrible years for Democrats, but then we still won in 1996 and in 2012. So another way to look at this is to look at special elections. Basically, there are special elections happening all the time, all over the country, whether it's on a state level or congressional level. And in 2017 and 2018, we were winning basically every single special election by landslides. And but since the 2018 elections, things have been much more muted. In general, we've been outperforming Clinton by about 1 or 2%, which is consistent with a close race. And just to give an example of that, just 2 weeks ago, we lost a House race in California. So I'm just going to be a little clear. This is a pre-COVID table, but prior to the coronavirus destroying any sense of measurement for what economic growth even means. Like if you went back to February, basically the way that people normally handicap presidential races before they look at polls is they say, well, what is Trump's approval rating, and how fast is economic growth? And if you looked at this in February, as opposed to now, you would have seen an answer that was roughly consistent with us getting 52% of the vote. And the problem is that due to the bias in the Electoral College, we need to get about 51.6% in order to win. So the election also, the fundamentals of the election, at least pre-COVID, point to a very close election. The other way to look at this is to just take an average of polls. This slide is from a while ago, but it hasn't changed. If you go and you just take an average of all of the public polls, you see that we're up by about 4, and we have to be up by about 3.6 in order to win. So it's very close. And so that's 2020. Everything is extremely close. Everything we all do matters because of that. So now I'll just talk a little bit. I'll use just the last bit of this talk to rush through talking a little bit about data science and how we think about things. So in terms of day-to-day, how my team and how other professionals are approaching our jobs, we think about politics in terms of 3 questions, which is what races are close, where should I spend my money, what messaging works and what messaging doesn't, and then once you decide what races are important and what messaging you should use, how should I actually talk to them and how do I reach them? And these are not solved problems, and our general approach coming out of 2016 was the traditional ways that people tried to solve them were broken. Phone surveys don't work anymore. Focus groups are unscientific, and traditional door knocks and mail aren't fit for the modern world, especially with coronavirus. So, just to talk a little bit about messaging, we put together, one of our big offerings are that we put together tooling to rigorously test whether or not advertisements work. And, we've tested over 200 different ads. And one of the things that comes out of it is that 1 in 5 ads that we make actually make people want to vote for Republicans. And, this gets at like a core challenge of being a political professional, which is that political professionals are not like swing voters. We're younger, we're whiter, we live in cities, we're much more liberal, and we don't have a ton in common with suburban, moderate white men in suburban Zanesville. And so that's why testing is so important. We went and we actually did a test where we went and we asked the staff what ads they liked the most, and it turned out it was negatively correlated with how they tested. And so that's like an underrated theory of change, is just be disciplined about what you talk about, and focus on things that actually persuade people and not on the things that we find most compelling. And just to talk a little bit about what ads worked well and what ads didn't, something that we really found was that ads that try to tie Democrats to popular stances on concrete economic issues that people care about, things like mental health, things like teacher salaries or affordable housing, do a lot to make these kind of persuadable white voters support us, while attacks on Trump on average have been much more muted. And just to put numbers on that, I think that our ads that have tried to tie Democrats to issues on average have been about 3 to 4 times as effective as personal attacks on Donald Trump. And then the last thing I'd say, obviously, you're not all making ads. I just wanted to talk a little bit at the very end about a tool that I personally worked on, in 2016 and helped get off the ground in 2018, which is Vote With Me. It's a relational organizing tool. It got about 300,000 downloads in 2018, and the basic idea is that it takes your phone list, it matches it to the voter file, and then tells you which of your friends haven't voted in the past, are registered Democrats, and who live in swing states. So, we've actually tested this, and we found that in general, person-to-person contact is about 5 times more effective than stranger-to-stranger contact. And so one of the simplest things you can do is to just go, obviously, I think this app really helps, but in general, just focus, when you're going, all of the organizing that Democrats Abroad is doing is great, but one of the biggest things you can do on top of that is to focus on your network. Look at your friends. You probably have a sense of who hasn't voted and who hasn't, and bug them and make sure they vote. You know, science shows it's actually incredibly effective. So that's all I've got. I'm happy to leave some time for questions.
Oh, thank you so much. It's really fascinating, and we're all interested in reviewing your slides once again because there's so much data packed into it. It's fantastic. One thing I really appreciated was that you ended letting us all know the importance of like relational organizing and how you can reach out to your friends and your friends can then reach out to other people as well. And you know what, we're seeing that Trump is doing a great job with this type of digital targeting as well. How is the Biden campaign doing in terms of their digital outreach and their digital targeting? Are they also using tools like this?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I actually know some of the people at the Biden Analytics campaign. You know, I would say when people talk about Trump's, you know, digital prowess, you know, I'd say that, you know, we've done analysis of Trump's digital buys, and the vast majority of it is them raising money. Raising money is important, but you know, something that's a real challenge that Democrats have, you know, when it comes to digital, is that, you know, when the group with Trump, the people that Trump wants to raise money from, you know, to be a little blunt, are like racist white people. And the people that he wants to persuade are racist white people. And the people that he wants to turn out are also like kind of low education racist white voters. And so he's really lucky that his persuasion targets, his get out the vote targets, and his fundraising targets are exactly the same. And the reason is like kind of non-intuitive and technical, which is that in the digital world, in the ad tech world, if you like with fundraising, you can observe your own conversions. If you show someone an ad and they click on it and then they donate, you can see that. And that means that Facebook's algorithms can go and do all their data science and target and find the best people. But the problem is that we have is that the people we want to raise money from, to be blunt, are like liberal white people. And the people that we want to persuade are like, you know, low education white people. And the people that we want to turn out are young non-white people. And so these are three very different groups of people. And so the danger is that if, you know, we might focus on, like, if the problem we have is that if somebody sees an ad and decides to become a Democrat, there's no tracking pixel in their brain. There's no way for us to know whether that works or doesn't work. But Trump has the luxury of knowing that if an ad fundraises well, it also probably works for persuasion or probably for GOTV. But for us, because we have like such a bigger coalition, it's much harder. But I'll say that I know people, you know, at the Biden team. I think that they've actually have a very impressive record. They've been putting out tons of content, and I'm personally very impressed with what they've done.
Super, thank you. Inga, you want to take the next question? Hope you're on mute, and I'll just unmute you. You're unmuted. Oh, there you go.
Hi, David. Thank you very much for talking to us again. It's great. Was wondering about the Senate, because you wrote about it in your recent pinned tweet that if we don't win this cycle, we'll be set back by a decade in the Senate. So what key races are you looking at in the Senate?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I'm saying anything secret. I think if you go and you look at, you know, the reality is that our path to taking the Senate involves taking out a bunch of Republican incumbents. And so in terms of, you know, what's important and what the public polls, you know, show are close, you know, it's places like Maine and Iowa and North Carolina and Georgia, Arizona, Colorado. You know, it's definitely true that this is kind of our one big chance to take it. Just, you know, the problem is that the Senate is structurally very biased against us. You know, it overrepresents the views of non-college, of rural voters who have, you know, become much more conservative over the past 10 years. And so we have a lot of incumbents in place in places like Montana and West Virginia that we're going to have trouble holding, you know, over the next decade. But this is a very good map for us, and we really do have a chance of capturing a trifecta and being able to make, systemic change that can make our electorate and election system more fair. But yeah, in terms of the states, I think it's the same ones that everyone's talking about. And one of the really interesting, sorry, 1 second. One of the really interesting things is just that in order for us to win, we're going to have to win in states that Trump is probably going to win. Like we have a shot. Like, I don't think I'm saying anything too radical when I say that we probably won't win Iowa, though we could, but we have a very serious chance of winning the Iowa Senate race. And so there's, basically this has shown up in public polls, but we're very lucky that Senate Democrats are polling much better. Biden is polling very, very well, to be clear, but our Senate Democrats are considerably outperforming Clinton and Biden. And if that continues, we have a very serious chance of taking the Senate.
Thanks so much. Go ahead, Emily.
Hi, David. Our next question, as a data scientist, do you have any ideas about our approach to testing in the pandemic? Why wasn't there more random testing early on or even now to give us more insight into the actual spread of the virus?
I will do the right thing and say that I'm not an epidemiologist. And so I don't want to second guess all of this stuff. I think all of us have learned a lot of amateur epidemiology over the last 3 months. I think the one thing I'd say is that nothing like this has ever happened before. And that makes, I think even in the narrow domain where coronavirus is impacting what I do, because there's like a lot of questions we get asked around, what is the impact of coronavirus going to be on turnout? Or, how is it our younger, how is that going to affect younger voters versus older voters? And even there, I have no idea. So I just try to, that's my main thought, is just when something happens for the first time, it's very hard. And so honestly, in my mind, everything has gone surprisingly well, given, obviously, Trump himself is bad for all kinds of reasons, but I think that when you think of the academic discipline, I'm almost pleasantly surprised at how well this has gone, given that nothing like this has ever happened before.
And then as the follow-up, how are you modeling unemployment and the economic hit among the various demographics as a result of this pandemic?
Yeah, that's a great question. We actually just put out a collaboration with the New York Times that I'm personally very proud of. It's something we spent some time on. So basically for us, one of our weighting variables, so people who take online surveys are kind of disproportionately likely to be self-employed. And so we always ask people about their employment status. And so we kind of unintentionally have surveyed tens of thousands of people over the last 2 months and asked them their employment status. And so something that we've been doing with the New York Times is just, we've built this like daily tracker to keep track of, what employment is across demographics. And it's something that's, one, politically relevant, just because it's very helpful, just to know the extent to the not equally distributed, nature of economic pain. One example is that among people who are part-time employed, I think the increase in unemployment has been 3 times higher than people who've been full-time employed. When you break things out by race or by age or by education, the impact has been much greater. And, we've definitely seen this correlate with the extent to which people are susceptible to coronavirus messaging.
Thanks so much. Go ahead, Aaron, you're up. Aaron? So our next question is
I'm on mute.
Oh, there you go.
There we go. Great. Super. Thanks, David. We, by the way, are receiving a lot of questions. So I'm sure there's a lot of people who want to talk to you about different things. So we're going to do our best to get as many as we can. But, really a whole bunch of questions relate from our members about, GOTV and what the type of GOTV that Democrats abroad members can do. Like, how do we best use our time? And so we specifically, what should we do with the demographics that we have to coordinate our efforts? And how can we best invest our time to do GOTV towards going towards November? And sort of related to that is, can your app, the app that you mentioned, be used internationally, given that so many of us, have international addresses that may or may not correspond to our data in the voter file back home? Thanks.
Yeah, these are great questions. So I'd say the single biggest. So I'd say there's two big best practices around get out the vote. The first is that any kind of relational organizing is really important. I was just, one of the big things that the Buttigieg campaign really was really focused on was this idea of not doing cold contacts. That means one, extending out into your networks. That's going to be incredibly effective. And the other is mechanically, if somebody reaches out to you in any way, responding to them as quickly as you can. It's an underrated thing. We called it, hot leads in the Obama campaign. We saw that if someone went on their website saying that they wanted to volunteer, if you responded to them within an hour, it was something like 20 times more effective than if you waited 2 weeks. And so that's really annoying. It's organizationally and logistically hard to respond really quickly to people, but it's very important. And then in terms of, demographics, I just think, you have just trying to talk to people who are connected to you in some way is like a best practice. I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't know there. And the other thing I'd say about Vote With Me is my suspicion is, the matching that it uses are names and phone numbers. So it actually probably has a pretty good, and emails. So it should have a pretty decent chance of working. The match rate might be lower than normal, but I think that if you use it, you still should probably be able to find a lot of people.
Thanks so much. So I have a question that's really related to Democrats abroad. In our primary, 50% of our voters were 40 and under. How does that compare to other states? And what would you suggest is the reason that we have such a young voter demographic for our primary?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So just to put some numbers on it, in the New Hampshire Democratic primary, roughly 15% of people were under the age of 45, which is wild. Primaries in general, very, very, very old on average. I think the median primary voter in Iowa was like 58. And so, this is structurally kind of a big problem with American democracy, and it kind of explains a lot of how the primary happened. But in terms of Democrats abroad specifically, I think it's really impressive. Obviously, I'm sure that the population abroad of young people and politically engaged young people is a lot, younger than average, but not by that much. So I think it really, probably a lot of the story is that, young people who do travel abroad are kind of more politically engaged than people who aren't. But I think it still speaks a lot to your organizing efforts, because you would really expect this to be a group with very, very low turnout and low engagement. So I think it's something to be proud of.
Well, thanks so much. We are proud of it. And we're also kind of interested in seeing how we can replicate this again in the general election. And, one thing I just want to make sure is everyone on this call, I hope before you get off the call or right after you get off the call, you go to votefromabroad.org and make sure you've requested your ballot this year. That's the first step in this whole process of voting in the general election. So if you have any questions, ping us, we'll help you. Next question, Inga, go for it.
Hi, can you comment on the 50% of the US population that doesn't vote? Is there an opportunity there? And why do you think they are generally not voting?
Yeah, obviously, we should do everything we can to try to boost turnout. The problem is just that it turns out that it is very hard. It is very hard to get people to vote. And I think that, in the Democratic Party, there's been this real desire to focus on get out the vote instead of persuasion, because they kind of view it as something that doesn't have any trade-offs. And I think, the main issue is that Democrats already invest an enormous amount in trying to get people out to vote. Because it's something that's very hard, something that we've noticed, when we study non-voters, they tend to be people who don't care very much about politics. They tend to be people who are moderate. One example, I think something like 60 or 70% of non-voters identify as moderate. And so, they're definitely much younger. They tend to move around a lot. And so something that we've really noticed is basically, when you look at what kind of get out the vote messaging works and what kind of get out the vote messaging doesn't work, you know, because these are people who aren't that focused on politics, something that we've seen work really well is just, you know, reminding people about their, you know, just reminding people to do it, kind of presenting it as like a social good, as something that they should be doing, telling them that it's going to be a really high turnout election, that other people are voting. And again, I know I keep saying this again and again, but the best way to get people to vote is for people in their networks to try to remind them to vote. Because, you know, the reason why they're not voting is because they don't follow politics very closely, and they're not as invested. And so just the act of someone in their network really telling them that this is something that they care about, you know, we've seen can have a really big impact.
Fantastic. Go ahead, Aaron, you have a question?
Yes, we have another question, which is back to back to polling and how questions are composed. And the question is, you know, how are questions composed and selected, and how is correlations with data assured? For example, in the 90s, your data said that people were more against immigration than against legalizing heroin, but it's such a complicated question culturally. How can the conclusions be made concerning correlation with party and or ideology or identity?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. You know, I think a big challenge, you know, when it comes to issue polling, is that most people don't follow politics very closely, and most people don't think a lot, you know, about different policies. And so, you know, something that's really tough is that when you the way that you ask things can, you know, the results of your poll can be really sensitive to the way that you ask things. And this is something that we spend a lot of time thinking about. You know, I've done a lot of work with a group called Data for Progress. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of them. And so one of the big things that, you know, we've done with them is we really wanted to solve this problem that we felt like a lot of polling that was out there was kind of propaganda. You know, you would go and you'd commission a poll and, you know, you'd ask people, do you think that we should have universal background checks? And 90% of people would say yes. And then then there'd be a ballot measure on it and made, and then it would fail. And you go, oh, well, these two things aren't consistent with each other. And so, yeah, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but we definitely noticed a phenomena where pollsters in general are like a fairly liberal group. And so the way that they ask things ends up creating this impression that the American public is extremely liberal on all of these issues, that they want the government to provide housing or healthcare to everyone. And, you know, the reality is more nuanced. And so we've spent a lot of time trying to think of different ways, you know, to ask these things. You know, something that we've done is we've done partisan priming, where we tell people, you know, Democrats want this and Republicans want this. Here are some pro and con arguments that different people make. And, you know, when we do that, we notice that suddenly these things get a lot closer. A lot of things that, you know, otherwise would be popular end up below water. But then the flip side is that, you know, while people have weak views on some issues, they do really have strong views on other issues. You know, one example of this that, you know, we wrote about is the idea of a job guarantee, where even when you go and you add pro and con messaging, you know, we found that a very substantial number of Trump voters, especially lower income Trump voters, really did believe that it was a good idea for the government to try to, you know, give people, unemployed people jobs. So yeah, I mean, it's part of the challenge. This is what sucks about surveys, is that it's not, you know, when we're doing measurement, it's not like we have a thermometer. It's not actually a well-defined concept, what people think about taxes. And so that's why we try to be really careful about what it is that we're actually trying to do and what this thing is supposed to predict. But it is hard.
Thanks. Go ahead, Emily.
Yeah, so since Democrats Abroad members are pretty much a large portion of the absentee voter participants, we were just wondering if you had any data on, you know, previous elections and absentee ballots and participation.
Especially overseas.
Yes.
Yeah, this is definitely a topic where you all know, I think, way more than I do. I'll say, you know, I'll say that the thing that's been really interesting with absentee voting is just basically, like, something that's new about the coronavirus era is that suddenly both sides are now paying a lot more attention to the size of the permanent absentee list. You know, like, it used to be that people would look at like voter registration statewide, where they'd say, oh, you know, how many Democrats are there versus Republicans? And now people are doing the same thing, just looking at the permanent absentee lists. And so, you know, when you look at but that's really all I had to say, is that it's something that honestly political professionals hadn't thought about that much before, but now that this election is going to be probably mostly absentee everywhere, it's suddenly something we're spending a lot more time about, you know, ballot chasing and all of these different dynamics.
Well, do you think this is going to be, we're already seeing some voter suppression coming out because of this, and do you think it's going to be a growing problem as we go towards November?
You know, the reality, and this has happened in every election, where in the states where we don't control government, you know, Republicans always do basically everything in their power, you know, to try to make it harder for us. And, you know, we've seen this in Wisconsin. And so, you know, hopefully, you know, there could be some federal legislation. It doesn't look like that's going to be forthcoming, unfortunately. So it's going to be hard. You know, luckily, there are a lot of liberal Democratic lawyers out there who are doing what they can, you know, to fight the fight. But it's gonna be a challenge.
Yep, we are gearing up for it. Appreciate that. Go ahead, Inga. You're next.
We've been getting a lot of questions about digital advertising. So we're wondering if you could talk a bit more about the impact of digital ads and the statistics you went through to discover that. Do Democrats have the right tools and knowledge to raise their digital game this year? And please say yes or something like it. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, there's been a lot of stories about Trump, and there were stories about Cambridge Analytica, and, you know, in theory, like, I think that there's this sense and story people tell that the particulars of digital targeting and digital advertising are really important. And, you know, to be clear, I think advertising is very important. I think that digital is, you know, roughly as effective as television per dollar. But I think that, you know, there's this sense that that really precise micro-targeting is what wins elections. And I think that, you know, that just isn't true. You know, the most important, like, something I like to tell people is that Hillary Clinton didn't lose because her lists weren't sorted correctly. You know, the reason she lost was because, broadly speaking, she strategically chose to do a bunch of personal attacks on Trump and not talk about issues that people cared about. And so, you know, I think that this is almost an uplifting thing about the world, which is that the way that you win elections, broadly speaking, is by you know, talking about issues that people care about and communicating that you share the values that other people share. And that's a lot more important than the particulars of, like, whether you use lookalike models or first party targeting or like any of the other digital targeting lingo. You know, obviously Democrats care a lot about this. And I think that in a lot of ways, you know, Democrats have a much harder digital targeting problem, which I kind of talked about earlier, because, you know, we have such a diverse coalition. And so we can't, you know, like, the danger we have is that the message, the kind of messaging that does a good job at raising us money isn't the same messaging that will appeal to voters. And so that's like a hard balance that we have to fight through. But I think, you know, stepping back, focusing on digital targeting is kind of a distraction from the larger problem of, like, you know, communicating that you share values and positions that regular people do.
Thanks. Aaron, I think you're up next. Oh, and you're on mute.
David, hi. We have people asking about what are the other, you interface with a lot of different progressive organizations and others all over. So what are the organizations that are doing the most strategic, targeted, and cost-effective voter registration and other mobilization efforts right now, either on the ground or digitally?
Yeah, so, you know, when it comes to voter registration, you know, I really want to throw out the Voter Participation Center. They're like not very well known, but they do incredible work. You know, they're probably the most cost-effective voter reg organization in the world. Their basic thing is the funny thing about voter registration is I think that people really like this idea of like going out on clipboards and like trying to sign people up. But scientifically, some of the best ways to register voters are just simple things like if somebody turns 18, send them a voter reg form, or if you see that somebody does an NCOA and moves, send them a voter reg form, or if you have addresses that don't have any registered voters in them, send them a voter reg form. And so that's the kind of work that they do. They're one of our clients, and I think they do amazing work. There are a bunch of other groups that are also doing great work, and I'm happy to collect a list if anybody wants to reach out after. But I would definitely shout out BPC and look at some of the groups that they work with.
Oh, fantastic. So do we have time for a few more questions? How are you doing with your time?
Yeah, I definitely have time.
Oh, wonderful. Thanks so much. So our next question is from Cindy. She said, how many people voted for other presidential candidates, and now Biden is the candidate during the primaries. And how do you think that, based on past experience, how will they change and shift towards November? What's your thoughts there in terms of the numbers?
Yeah, I mean, I think people have been losing, there have been competitive primaries all the time. And, the sad reality is that when like if you look in 2008, roughly 20% of Hillary voters didn't vote for Obama in 2008. In 2016, my best guess is something like 10 to 12% of Sanders voters ended up voting for Trump. And some of this is a measurement artifact of the fact that there were a lot of protest votes. All these people in West Virginia who voted against Clinton for Sanders probably aren't really what we think of as Sanders voters. But I think what's interesting, we've done a lot of research on who are, first of all, obviously the vast majority of people who supported Bernie Sanders in the primary are going to vote for Joe Biden. But something that I think is really interesting is when you look at who are these Sanders Trump voters, they're not, for the most part, they're not leftists. They identify as conservative or as moderate. They tend to not have college degrees. They tend to be younger, and so when you're the group that we're talking about here, and this is also true of the people who are undecided or who say that they might not vote, is I think the danger is that Democrats will, in trying to win these voters back, and we should, they'll think that the path to winning these voters back is highly ideological, when a lot of these marginal voters who were up for grabs, they didn't like Sanders for ideological reasons. They liked him because, he was anti-establishment, or, because or some broad thematic change. And so that's just something important to remember. I think, the Biden campaign is doing a lot to try to, there's all of the commissions, but it's just something that happens every primary cycle. And, low key, my main takeaway from all of this is that primaries are not, it seems bad that we spent like $500 or $600 million making all of our politicians less likable. That seems bad. We probably should, other countries don't do it this way. We should probably figure out a better way to do this, or at least have spending limits or something. But I do think, there is a real sense in which competitive primaries are bad. There's a lot of political science literature that shows that, fundamentally there is a cost that gets paid for this kind of thing. And so there's going to be some penalty, but obviously the vast majority of Bernie voters are going to end up voting for Biden.
We definitely hope so. And we're working on that, with all of our team. So Emily, you want to take the next question?
Yeah, so we were wondering, the polls that you're working with, are they predominantly in English? And are there other polling that you've been doing that's in other languages for, naturalized citizens or other populations that sometimes tend to be ignored, such as, Hispanic or the Asian American population? How are you talking to them?
Yeah, that's a great question. The first answer is, we do historically, we do some bilingual polls. One of the things it does highlight, sometimes you have to confront in this job a lot of the bad social problems and social inequities that exist in the US, where even though a very large proportion of, Latinx Americans, prefer to speak in Spanish, these are voters who are less likely to be citizens, they're less likely to vote. And so even in Florida, I think the percentage of the electorate that actually, prefers Spanish over English is something like 2 or 3%. So, it's an annoying thing where, because it's less important from a measurement perspective in like a really concrete sense, because there's such lower rates of turnout and lower rates of citizenship. But it's absolutely, we do bilingual polls, and when you look at when you're doing, it just depends on where in the country you are. Obviously, if you're in Iowa, it's less important. But in 2018, there were a bunch of competitive House districts in California that had very hot, large Vietnamese populations or Chinese populations, and then it's something that you really have to worry about. Just on the Spanish side, when we were just getting started, it was really interesting because we didn't. We did a survey in Puerto Rico, and we didn't have any have resources because we were a startup to hire translators, and so we're all just figuring out, how do you say caucus in Spanish? What is it? It's like it is one of the challenges of the job.
Thanks so much. And Inga, you want to take the next question, and then we'll go to the last one.
I think one of the things that we've been seeing since 2016 and Trump's victory is the amount of misinformation and false news and bizarre campaigns and stuff on social media and elsewhere, and in 2016 versus 2018. So I guess the question I want to ask is, what kind of impact is that sort of campaigning, is the very strange media environment going to have on the campaign this year? And is there anything we can do about it?
So I have some good news here, which is, everybody worries about fake news and Twitter botnets and all of this other stuff. And, the reality is that while conservative, we've looked at basically the media consumption habits of conservatives and, independent voters and Democrats. And while it's definitely true that conservatives read all kinds of crazy shit, moderate voters and swing voters actually overwhelmingly get their news from mainstream sources. And so there is a danger to this stuff, and obviously it's bad and we should do what we can to combat it. I'd say the single most important way that this stuff ends up impacting things is that, you can have a story kind of live on the fringes in the fringe internet, and then that lets it bubble around. And if enough conservatives on Twitter talk about this crazy fringe thing, then the mainstream media will report on it because they're on Twitter and they see it happen. And so, that's kind of I think the most important thing we can do, given that people consume their news on mainstream media, is to do everything we can to try to make mainstream media be a little more responsible about what they report and what they don't. That's obviously very hard. The kind of the point of mainstream media. Media independence is great and all of that, but I do think that we're kind of at the mercy of them to be responsible in their coverage. But I think it does recast. The reason to be concerned about it is because of what the mainstream media does. The good news is that swing voters, for the most part, don't actually read fake news, and that's something to be happy about. There's one bit of good news in this whole thing.
That's actually really reassuring. It is definitely great news. Aaron, do you want to take our last question?
Sure. You unmuted me? Sure. David, a lot of our members are study abroad students who unfortunately might be home right now because of COVID, but we also have a youth caucus that's very active. And so, always looking about the next generation and thinking about, people who might want to be data scientists or get involved in politics, or, think about what they could be studying now, preparing themselves now to, for their professional careers. What suggestions do you have for people who might want to be data scientists, or really, how to think even about the next emerging fields and how to, study for those?
That's a great question. So I was really lucky in that I decided to, get into data science stuff in 2008, which is great advice I'd give anyone with a time machine. But I'd say, just in terms of obviously we do, Civis is about 200 people, and I've been there since start, so we've done a lot of hiring. I'd say some really concrete advice is, I think, to basically, one, learn SQL. Basically all real organizations keep their data in databases, and learning how to interface with those databases is just really underrated. I think in terms of when you're trying to apply for a job, especially as like a student or as an intern, I'll say as someone who's hiring, the main thing that you're thinking about is, can this person be useful like in the first week of hiring them, particularly in an internship? They're going to have like 5 weeks. And so, the way to make it so that you could be useful is to have familiarity with SQL and familiarity with, basic scripting languages like, Python or R. This is like one of those things where if you spend like a weekend learning the basics of a thing, you can suddenly have a leg up over like 80% of your applicants. There aren't many things like that in that world, so that's why I'm sharing that. The other thing I'd say that's really underrated if you want to go into data science is that actually most data science in this world is really that you're fitting a bunch of simple linear models, and so there's an entire. So sorry for all the non-data scientists in the audience, but so really just there's an entire field around this called econometrics. If you can take an econometrics elective in college, I did, and it was honestly the most useful class I took. But just spending time reading about simple linear models, Python, SQL, that's the in terms of what I would do if I was trying to get data science jobs. That's the advice I'd give. And then, the other thing I'd just say is that, this particular field that I work in, which is doing data science for politics, it's been really exciting. Kind of, when I started in this field, in 2010 or 2012, there were like 5 people who were doing this, and now there's like 300 or 400. It's like a pretty big community. Obviously there's a bunch of firms that do it, and I think it's pretty fulfilling work. So if there's anyone in the audience who has any questions about it, what the field is like, just let me know. Always happy to chat.
Well, thank you so much for that. And, also if there's anyone in the audience who is interested in working on some projects with Democrats abroad in this area, there's not a lot of study done with overseas voter data. And it would be a really great project for you to use to highlight your experiences and get some practice. That's my volunteer request plug right there. But thank you so much, David. It was a true pleasure to have you on the call today. We learned a lot, and you gave us some great information. I really appreciate your time and everyone else's time for joining us. I also want to mention that we are going to be hearing next week, in our next week's speaker series is from Robert Reich. There's a link I'm going to pop in the chat box for everybody. So join us next week on Friday for another call. And again, as a reminder, please, if you haven't yet requested your ballot, go to votefromabroad.org and do that today. It's really important to get started. Emily, would you like to wrap up the call? Thank you so much again, David. Ciao.
Yes, thank you, David. And we hope that everyone has enjoyed this event with David just as much as I did, and I know the rest of our panelists did. We really appreciate David's support, and we also appreciate all of our volunteer support, and also everyone that's attended. So I hope you know that your support goes a long way. So if you can, please visit democratsabroad.org/donate so that we can continue to bring more events like these to Americans around the world. We'd also love to have you help us as a volunteer if you're not doing so already. As I'm sure you're aware, it's all hands on deck this year. We have less than 6 months till Election Day, so if you'd like to get involved, you can go to democratsabroad.org/volunteer to sign up. New first-time volunteers, of course, are very welcome. And with that, we're going to end this call. We want to thank David again and everyone who took the time to join us today, and we hope everyone has a great weekend.